Ever wondered what a fictional denial about a Downing Street Christmas party would sound like? This video of a press conference rehearsal leaked out tonight might offer a clue.
This is recorded. This fictional party was a business meeting. And it was not socially distanced.
One week on from the Mirror scoop, the government still hasn't really got its story straight about what happened at Downing Street on December the 18th. What should the failure to completely admit or consistently deny the party happened tell us? Also tonight, a Newsnight exclusive after the Kabul whistleblower, a current Foreign Office civil servant whose identity we have to protect, tells us the government's evacuation chaos was unforgivable. And we're in Greater Manchester, asking what the region needs to really level up. Hello, good evening. Imagine, if you will, a fictional party, more of a business meeting, but with wine and cheese and no social distancing under Tier 3 restrictions. These were the explanations given by Boris Johnson's former spokeswoman, Allegra Stratton, who was caught on footage filmed last December, published just today, trying to work out the answers to any questions that might come about from this purely invented scenario. Have a look.
I've just seen reports on Twitter that there was a Downing Street Christmas party on Friday night. Do you recognise those reports?
I went home. Hold on.
Would the Prime Minister condone having a Christmas party?
What's the answer?
I don't know.
It wasn't a party, it was cheese and wine.
Just be clear, it's not.
Is cheese and wine all right?
No.
It was a business meeting.
I'm joking.
This is recorded. This fictional party was a business meeting. And it was not socially distanced.
Well, viewers will make their own mind up about whether this is proof the December the 18th Downing Street Christmas party actually happened, or just a peculiar coincidence that a group of staffers hit upon this story for their first press conference rehearsal. Either way, perhaps the most striking thing is that 1 year on, they still haven't found a clear answer within government to explain what did or did not happen at a time when government messaging was so vital to protect people's lives.
All I can tell you is that whatever would have happened in number 10, all rules would have been followed
So
at all
you're certain
times.
that that report is inaccurate?
I can tell you all rules would have been followed at all times.
What I can tell the right honourable gentleman is that all guidance was followed completely during number 10.
Was there a party?
I have no idea. I wasn't there. But
okay.
I'm told by those who were that all the guidance was observed.
You've said no rules were broken, which is fine. Why don't you just make this story go away and tell us what happened?
Because I've told you.
Given you have not denied there was a party, thereby breaking the rules, what have you got to say to those bereaved families?
Well, no, what I've said throughout is that since this thing was brought up, is that's not true. We followed the guidance throughout and continue to follow the guidance.
Number 10 have been very clear. There was no party and there were no rules breached.
So was it a party where the guidelines were followed, or was it not a party?
I can tell you that the guidelines were followed at all times.
Well, did you investigate that yourself? Have you satisfied yourself that
I have satisfied myself that the guidelines were followed at all times.
Let's talk to Lewis Goyle about all this. The government, the PM himself, has had ample opportunity to deny it. 1 week on from that story breaking, still unclear what the government's response to this is. Where does this take us, Lewis?
Well, Emily, as you say, this has now been going on for the best part of a week, day after day. Ministers, the Prime Minister himself, being given opportunity to try and clear up, to elaborate what happened that night. I think what has just happened tonight is it sent this story up 100 notches, somewhere just south of the political stratosphere. Why? Well, I think for two reasons. First of all, you cannot underestimate the extent to which the public really care about COVID restrictions, and they care about the extent to which those who are in power are seen to abide by it themselves. This story, that clip from ITV News is now being played on every news bulletin, across every social media platform tonight. It was even on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. This has got legs. It's clearly got the potential to cut through in a very serious way. But there's another second important reason why it's serious for the Prime Minister as well, and it's about process. That might sound dull and technical, but it's not. Just as you've said, the Prime Minister and others have had the opportunity to elaborate and make clear what has happened. On each and every occasion, they have chosen not to do so. They haven't said anything beyond the guidance has been met and then given a variety of different explanations on each and every opportunity. This now brings into question exactly why Number 10 and the Prime Minister himself haven't been more straightforward about this matter for the last week. And those are the questions that clearly the Prime Minister is going to have to find answers to at Prime Minister's Questions tomorrow, where Keir Starmer is going to call into question his integrity and his honesty, as he already has done, and more importantly for the Prime Minister as well, his own MPs, some of whom I've been talking to this evening, are really, really angry about this. They think it's redolent of the Owen Paterson affair, and they think they've literally played into the Labour attack, which is there's one rule for them and one rule for the public.
I guess we should say, Lewis, that this video, the evidence of the video, doesn't mean there was any proof the party happened. It was clearly a sort of rehearsal scenario where you can imagine the spokeswoman herself saying, ask me difficult questions, let's see how I cope with the answers. I'm practicing, let's see if I sound fluent about this, rather than any definite proof that, you know, a party happened.
Indeed, Emily, but of course, as I say, it goes back to that fundamental question, which is since our colleagues at the Daily Mirror broke this story a week ago, Number 10 could well have come up with an explanation to say, well, this happened, there's this many people were there, nothing, and so on. There hasn't been a consistent explanation, and that is what, as I say, Boris Johnson is going to have to, and maybe there will be an explanation. But tonight, the Number 10 have issued a statement which effectively says, sticks to the old line, which as a guidance was followed, there was no party. As Conservative MPs themselves are saying tonight, that's not going to cut it, and the Prime Minister is going to have a more substantial explanation when he faces MPs tomorrow.
Lewis, thanks very much indeed. We did bid the government on this story. They said no. But joining us instead, Henry Hill, the news editor at Conservative Home, and Adam Wagner, a lawyer from Doughty Street Chambers. Nice to have you both. Adam, let's just talk about the form of words, because what you notice from the clips when you play them back to back is that slightly strange, almost sort of strangulated repetition that no rules were broken, whilst never actually clarifying what, if anything, happened. Now, is that a kind of legal speak, a lawyer speak that you would recognise? Adam, we haven't got your sound. Can you just check you're not... start again. That's it, we've got you.
They're saying no guidance is broken, not no rules are broken. And I think that is interesting language. And as I'm listening to that clip, I was wondering, well, are they worried that by admitting a breach of any rules, they may be putting themselves in legal peril and putting the people who attended those parties in legal peril? Because I think there is an open question. It's not clear, but there is an open question that the Metropolitan Police are going to be looking at as to whether any criminal laws have been broken. And I do wonder whether that's what's going on now, that's the reason, because quite obviously there was a party. I mean, you know, they barely denied it. And I think that the line they're taking is a very as you say, is an odd one. So I do wonder now whether they're worried about the legal peril.
Just explain to us the difference between guidance and rules, because as I understood it, when Tier 3 restrictions came in, that wasn't guidance, was it? They were rules.
Yeah, so Tier 3 was in place at the time. It meant you couldn't have an indoor gathering unless it was reasonably necessary for work and clearly a pre-arranged Christmas party with games and that sort of thing wouldn't be reasonably necessary for work. There's a couple of potential legal ambiguities. First of all, whether the rules applied, the law applied to Number 10 Downing Street at all, because there's a bit in the Public Health Act which says it doesn't apply to Crown properties. It's not clear whether that means it doesn't apply to individuals. And there's also a question of whether it was a particular kind of gathering that could be held indoors, but I'm not convinced by that. So it could have been against the law. Certainly was against guidance, because the guidance at the time throughout December said you must not have a work Christmas lunch or party where this is a primarily social activity and is not otherwise permitted by the rules in your tier. So I think from it seems from what's described, it was against the guidance. Whether it was against the law will be a matter for the police.
Henry, is there a form of words that you think the party would like to hear tonight? I mean, are people worried in general, or have they sort of dismissed this?
No, I mean, I think ideally they'd want to be hearing an actual denial, although it seems to be quite clear at this point that the government doesn't have one. You know, the Prime Minister spent all of this money on this room and everything else, and this is the only story that we've got out of it, is this strange, you know, absolutely bizarre theatrical villain type admitting, seemingly, to breaking the rules. I think the party will be very worried because often a lot of these things have bounced off Boris Johnson in the past, and so you can never tell for sure which ones are going to stick. But I think the reason that they're so worried about this one is that we're coming up to Christmas. The Prime Minister potentially is going to have to make a very important decision about whether or not we get to go home and see our families for the second year in a row. And he's now going to be making that decision in the shadow of this. And therefore, I think there's potential, not just for public anger at this happening, but if the government, for public health reasons, has to cancel Christmas again, that risks enormous public anger, which every Tory MP will hear in their mailbox. I mean, there is an argument that he is, you know, the senior figure covering for very junior staff. He wasn't at the party if the party went ahead. There is no implication that he was actually there, that he's just thinking these are young people who were kind of just doing, you know, what they were doing on a Friday night, and it's his job to sort of cover for them. I think to an extent, but the flip side of that argument is that he's the leader. He's supposed to show leadership. He's supposed to set an example. Downing Street is his place of work. He is ultimately in charge, and he was giving instructions to the entire nation, including a nation full of young people whose, you know, clubs were closed for a year, who missed out on Freshers' Week at university. You know, loads of young people suffered quite a lot as a result of the COVID restrictions, perhaps reasonably. So I think that, yes, you know, in a narrow sense, he wasn't at this party. It is probably right that he tries to protect the junior-most staff, although somebody in a position of responsibility made a petition to hold this party. But ultimately, he can't keep hiding behind, you know, this person in my office did this person in my office did that. He is the Prime Minister. The buck stops with him, when it comes to the nation, and especially when it comes to the conduct of the operation inside Downing Street. So just talk us through this Crown Properties rule, Adam. I mean, could that have been used with a straight face? Are you surprised that wasn't thrown out?
Well, I mean, it's just never been resolved because this kind of thing hasn't happened before. And I mean, what I'm interested in is what they thought they were doing at the time. You know, this apparently wasn't the only party that was held. There was apparently Gavin Williamson held a party for staff, for about 20 staff, and there was another one, a leaving do in November, when that was during lockdown. So what did I'd want to know what the government thought it was doing. Did they think that they weren't bound by the rules, or did they think that the rules didn't apply?
Can I just bring?
The rules didn't apply to parties.
I'll bring our viewers up to speed on that one, because a lot of people won't have heard about this, and we've had actually a statement from the Education Department this evening clarifying this party that Gavin Williamson was at, and they said it was a gathering of colleagues. It was only people from the office. There were drinks and snacks there. It was work related, but they do say that looking back, we accept it would have been better not to have gathered in that way at that particular time. I mean, that's a very, very clear form of words from another department. I mean, do you think they're saying that with the benefit of hindsight as to how you don't answer the question? Yes, potentially. But again, and without knowing the exact nature of what went on, it might also be that they simply had a more defensible gathering, right? We don't know the thing. We don't know what happened inside the 10 Downing Street party, and therefore we can't really be sure why Downing Street's being as vague as it's being. But you're right. I think that Conservative MPs, what they really want to hear, but if they would have heard it, it would have been a week ago, is for Downing Street to come out and say, this is what happened. We thought it was within the rules, or we thought it was reasonable for X, Y, and Z reasons. Maybe we got that wrong and we're sorry. But they haven't had that. They've had a week of evasions. And the more that happens as day after day goes by, when Downing Street won't be clear, the more the fear is growing that actually this was just an egregious breach of the rules. And if it then comes out that it was an egregious breach of the rules, that will create a very difficult Christmas for an awful lot of Conservative MPs who've been out defending the government line to their constituents. Do you think, I mean, do you really think the police should be investigating this, Adam? Do you think this is in anyone's interest, that you actually get the police involved in something like this and make it into a criminal affair?
Look, I mean, there were thousands of people who were prosecuted and given very large fixed penalty notices. I mean, I had 7 student clients who were given £10,000 fixed penalty notices a couple of months before this for holding parties of this kind of size. Look, I think there is a public interest in putting a lot of what happened during the COVID lockdowns behind us in terms of policing time, and also not encouraging people to report on their neighbours for breaking lockdown. But equally, there is a public interest in looking at what was happening at the centre of government. And particularly if, I come back to, what did they think they were doing? Did they think they were breaking the law? Did they suspect they were breaking the law? And if so, that is a lot more serious than a student holding a house party at the time, because that is actually the Prime Minister's own backyard. And they are, potentially avoiding criminal penalties or, covering things up. So I think there should be a wider investigation. It may not be that there's a criminal case to answer, and it may be that the police decide not to deal with it. I think that ultimately this will be a political scandal, much more than a legal scandal, probably. But as we come into this next period of potentially more lockdowns or, huge amounts of people self-isolating because of their connected to people with Omicron variants, the government needs to build public trust to be able to sell that and to make people follow those rules.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thank you. The testimony of a 25-year-old whistleblower in the Kabul Foreign Office is as jaw-dropping as it is harrowing. The stories of chaotic and dysfunctional decision-making that meant only a fraction of those in need were helped to escape. The Prime Minister has today dismissed the reports of Raphael Marshall, a civil servant so distressed by what he saw that he left his job, and today called the Afghan evacuation one of the outstanding military achievements of the last 50 years. But today, Newsnight has heard from a second witness, a current Foreign Office civil servant with decades of experience in international work, who told us the government's handling of the evacuation of Afghanistan was unforgivable. Speaking exclusively to this programme, she said trauma and suffering was caused by the way it was managed. She requested her identity be protected over fears of losing her job. Well, we'll be hearing that interview in just a moment. But first, Lewis Goodall, our policy editor, is back at the wall. Lewis.
Yes, Emily. Do you remember this?
Very few countries could have pulled off the Kabul airlift.
Well, a whistleblower, Raphael Marshall, disagreed. He's left the Foreign Office now and in shocking testimony to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee painted a picture of chaos. He said the lack of planning, ministerial decision-making and chaotic systems of the Foreign Office had left people being left to die, quote, at the hands of the Taliban. It also raises questions about what ministers said at the time. For instance, when the Prime Minister on the 26th of August said this.
We've got the overwhelming majority of those to whom we owe that debt out of Afghanistan as I stand and talk to you now. In the time we have left, which may be, as I'm sure everybody can appreciate, quite short, we'll do everything we can to get everybody else.
Well, not so, said the whistleblower. He said that thousands were left behind as a result of the chaos. Not only that, but as we reported at the time, it was very hard to see how the Prime Minister could credibly make that claim, given it seemed the system was overwhelmed. How would we know if the overwhelming majority had been evacuated, if large numbers of applications hadn't even been looked at, let alone processed? We asked Downing Street today if they stood by the Prime Minister's assertions. They didn't get back to us. Mr. Marshall said another factor which contributed to the malaise was that the then Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, was slow to respond. He said that Mr. Raab didn't understand the issues at hand. This aligns with what sources have told this programme, with one Foreign Office source telling us this. Raab was definitely slow to respond when he actually bothered to. His office was reluctant to disturb him in general outside of working hours, Afghanistan aside. Mr. Raab has rejected this accusation today and pointed to the 15,000 who were rescued thanks to the UK's efforts. And Foreign Office civil servants are hardly off the hook either. The Permanent Secretary, Philip Barton, was on holiday like Dominic Raab at the time. He said this to the Select Committee today.
I have reflected a lot since August on my leave, and if I had my time again, I would have come back from my leave earlier than I did. I did put in place, as I think you know, cover arrangements, both an acting permanent secretary in the normal way, but also a director general to lead in parallel on our Afghanistan work, and I stayed in touch with the department all the way through the period closely through August. But as I say, I do. If I had my time again, I would have come back from my leave earlier.
Then there was the controversy over pen farthings animals. At the time, when questioned as to whether they were given resources over and above refugees, ministers insisted that they weren't. Yet, Mr. Marshall said this. There was a direct trade-off between transporting Nowzad's animals and evacuating UK nationals and Afghan evacuees, including Afghans who had served with British soldiers. And what of policy since? Well, on the 18th of August, Priti Patel tweeted this: "Today we launch our new Afghan resettlement scheme. It will welcome up to 20,000 people forced to flee from Afghanistan, prioritise women, girls, children and others most in need and save lives." Many are indeed still waiting for it. But if you go to the Home Office's website today for that scheme, it comes up with this: "The scheme is not yet open. Please check this page regularly. Further details will be announced in due course." All of this while famine ravages Afghanistan. As one MP said today, the danger is the people who the scheme is meant to help are dead before they can even apply. One Conservative MP described this as a failure of statecraft. It seems inevitable that it's a failure some who helped Britain still in Afghanistan will pay the price.
Thanks, Lewis. So tonight, reinforcement of the account that Raphael Marshall gave to the Foreign Office Select Committee, this time from someone still working with that same team, who told us the government's handling had been unforgivable. She sat down earlier with Seema Kotecha, and to protect her identity, we've reconstructed her interview with an actor's voice.
Do you recognise the definition that we've been hearing today from a former civil servant, saying that it was disorganised, it was dysfunctional, it was slow?
There were a lot of people, there was a lot of activity, but absolutely no sort of induction, no objectives, no handover, no ability to access the systems, often just to find out the very basics in a very unstructured and chaotic environment.
We've also heard so many stories about emails not being answered, thousands of emails not being answered, not even being looked at.
It was certainly the case that when there was parliamentary and public pressure, and it was out there that thousands of emails were going unread, that was addressed. But the whole focus then shifted to literally that, to reading the emails. When we did have objectives, it was read the emails. So you had dozens of people reading harrowing, horrific bits of information and knowing full well that nothing was going to be done with any of it, other than a report at the end of the day to say the email had been read.
I mean, one allegation we've heard today is that Dominic Raab, his actions towards this whole crisis, which is what many are calling it, was actually slow.
His focus in terms of decisions that I did see being made was on responding to political and high-profile media pressure. So I would see very quick responses to some of the high-profile kind of cases that were in the press or that questions had been asked about by MPs, in the context of a total absence of decisions on the thousands of others who didn't have somebody well connected championing or asking about them as individuals. It seemed to me that the entire operation was to manage the political fallout of what was happening, rather than to actually manage the crisis. And that, for me, was the most upsetting.
I mean, you know, we've heard ministers say today it was a very difficult situation. They were dealing with something that they hadn't seen coming. You know, many people have said, even the military, that the Taliban took over at such a fast pace. Is there an argument that it was difficult to handle and that, you know, all of this was a result of the unforeseen circumstances?
This is by far the biggest crisis response that I had seen or been involved with. It was a huge challenge. I don't accept the argument that I do accept the government didn't see it coming. I think we should have seen it coming. The FCDO as an organisation was completely ill-equipped to respond, and I think a huge part of that is organisationally, in terms of the Department for International Development was abolished and merged into the former Foreign Office, and we were incapable of coming together as one organisation to respond.
How would you describe the way ministers behaved here?
I think it's unforgivable. That's how I'd describe it.
And what do you mean by that? I mean, are you saying that lives have been lost because of the way it was handled?
I expect that might well be the case. I can certainly say that huge amounts of trauma and suffering were either caused directly because of the way it was handled, most probably lives also lost.
We've heard the government say that, you know, they didn't do anything wrong. They say that, yes, some decisions weren't made quickly enough, but on the whole, 15,000 people were evacuated.
I think that is was an incredible achievement. And I don't want any of this to take away from what was achieved. I think, however, a lot of trauma and suffering, certainly, most likely worse, was also caused that shouldn't have happened because of the chaos within the bigger system and the political focus on managing reputation in relationships instead of the actual crisis. And I think government should recognise and accept that, because that's the first step in actually learning and addressing things.
Seema Kotecha, who had been speaking to a civil servant with many years of experience in the Kabul evacuation team there. Well, a government spokesperson told us UK government staff worked tirelessly to evacuate more than 15,000 people from Afghanistan within a fortnight. This was the biggest mission of its kind in generations and the second largest evacuation carried out by any country. We're still working to help others leave. More than 1,000 FCDO staff worked to help British nationals and eligible Afghans leave during pitting. The scale of the evacuation and the challenging circumstances meant decisions on prioritisation had to be made quickly to ensure we could help as many people as possible. Joining us now, the Conservative chairman of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, and Labour's Baroness Helena Kennedy QC, who's been working to rescue female judges from Afghanistan. Tobias, can I just start with you? We heard from the civil servant in that interview. There was no induction, no objectives, no handover, just an unstructured and chaotic environment. She said it was unforgivable, actually.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, the operation, the evacuation itself, 15,000, absolutely was successful in its own right, but thousands were left behind and they still can't get out today. And these testimonies, I think, should not be dismissed. They actually confirm what many of us have known for some time, is that the Foreign Office was not well led at this time. Emails were not answered. MPs can validate that. There were inadequate foreign language skills, a shortage of IT systems. And for me and for Tom Tugendhat, it underlines the absolute importance of why we need a full, independent Afghan inquiry to look into these issues. It also begs the question of the wider issues of the handling of Afghanistan away from this, about situational awareness, about decision-making, the ability to form strategies and plan. This goes to the leadership of the FCDO today.
Right, and you're saying this, and Tom Tugendhat, we heard, was calling for this, but Boris Johnson today has called the Kabul evacuation one of the outstanding military achievements of the last 50 years. Does he believe that? Do you?
It's a military achievement. Operation Pitting was a military achievement. It was an incredible effort to get the air bridge to evacuate those people in that amount of time. But the bigger picture is that France managed to get all their people out months in advance. And other countries have programs in place that are working today, but Britain doesn't have that. But the wider picture, and I stress, is to do with Whitehall's international outlook, how you link together foreign, security, aid and trade initiatives to form grand policy strategies. That is missing at the moment. We don't have a collective approach on Afghanistan. We don't have one for Mali. We don't even have one for Russia at the moment. And this needs to change if we really want to be serious about global Britain.
Helena Kennedy, the government said it worked tirelessly to evacuate more than 15,000 people from Afghanistan within a fortnight, the second biggest evacuation of any country.
I agree with Tobias and Tom Tugendhat. I mean, I think that the military evacuation was an incredible feat and done in extremis in short order. But the shocking thing is, Emily, is that we knew for months that there was going to be a moment of evacuation. And what I don't understand is that teams weren't put in place inside the Foreign Office, already inside the Home Office too, to deal with the fact that there were going to be large numbers of people who had been there doing important work which was benefiting us. I mean, let me just give you examples about the women judges. It's rather extraordinary. I didn't set out saying that I was going to start chartering planes and so on. My team at the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, we've never done that kind of work. We've trained judges and lawyers around the world on all kinds of things. We've watched trials and all kinds of stuff like that. But we've never actually had to do an evacuation like this. And it fell to us because government failed to do some of this stuff. Now, we actually were involved in...
Helena, we've just lost you. Oh, yeah, you're back.
we ended up having to charter planes of judges who ran not just the women's courts, bringing sort of dealing with violence against women and forced marriages and all of that, but also women who were running narcotics courts that we helped create, which were to deal with all those Taliban guys who were basically trading in heroin in order to fund terrorism.
Right.
So
it was working against our own mission. Tobias, let me just ask you, because you pointed the finger very strongly at Whitehall, and what our civil servant said, of course, was that it was the Department of International Development being merged with the Foreign Office that left everyone ill-equipped to respond. Now, that's not the stuff that civil servants at Whitehall can sort out. That's top of the government decision-making.
It is. It's how the National Security Council works. It's how these departments operate. I'm afraid Whitehall departments continue to be far too siloed. We saw this with the public disagreements between the MOD and the FCDO during the evacuation when it actually took place itself. There's also the initiatives as well. The department has become far too risk averse. It used to be a department that had the ideas, that had the initiatives, that showed the statecraft, that actually encouraged other nations to follow our lead. And we need to rekindle that, absolutely, because there's an absence of international leadership at the moment. And I really do want Britain to fill that gap.
I mean, I guess you could say, Helena, that there is a recognition that things didn't go according to plan. The right leadership here wasn't in place because Dominic Raab was moved on pretty quickly after that whole episode and is no longer the Foreign Secretary.
Well, I mean, I'm sure that there was fallout and therefore there had to be movement. But it goes back to the business, which is we knew for some months that there was going to be an evacuation and we should have already been making lists of people who were going to have to be protected. We should have been creating teams. Some of my women judges were actually contacting that email account and sending their desperate messages, which were ultimately read many months later. We tried to contact that email account. The Institute of Human Rights has sent emails to them with lists of women and the messages were sent to us. And so in the end, we ended up having to do this ourselves. And our women are sitting now in Athens in a lily pad, waiting to be resettled. And I think Britain owes it to them to do something about it before Christmas.
When you juxtapose, Tobias, what Helena's telling you about chartering planes to get our Afghan judges that were literally trying to keep the country on its feet, and you compare that to what we heard today from Dominic Dye, who was confirming that Boris Johnson had been involved in the evacuation of Pen Farthing's animals. How do you reconcile those two?
I can't. And this is why we do need an investigation, is to understand whether there was a bit of micromanaging that was going on. I mean, there were military call signs. You couldn't land at Kabul airport because the Americans had run it unless you had a military call sign. It wasn't so straightforward just to charter a plane and get in there. So there are some practical, technical reasons why. But you now need to look ahead as well. This is far from over. This is a country about to go through one of the challenging winters you can imagine. There's going to be widespread famine. 1 million children, could die this winter. We need to be at the forefront of this. We need to use the Qatar embassy that has a link there to have our own people based in Kabul. We need to re-engage with the Taliban itself. We need to actually get those international organizations operating on the ground. This is the sort of thing that Britain used to do really, really well. And I hope that Liz Truss will now, focus on this 100% because it will be on us if these people die this winter.
We're going to have to leave it there. Forgive me, Tobias, a very sharp gear change, which I hope people will understand. But just on our first story this evening, which was that video of the Downing Street party, we remember, of course, that you were made to apologise for an after-dinner speech that you made during COVID restrictions. And I seem to remember at the time, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, called it an egregious breach that should be followed up. So I'm wondering what your feeling is now that the tables have turned slightly. Would you like to see the police following up this?
No, I mean, that event you've spoken about was an Iraqi embassy-sponsored event. It was in line with the COVID restrictions, the tier 2 at the time, not full lockdown. But we need to get ahead of this story today. The government, needs to show that it takes it seriously. It's understandable that the government wants to focus on this coming Christmas, not the last one, given the worrying development of this Omicron variant. But nevertheless, if questions are still outstanding, let's task Simon Case or, the Cabinet Secretary, head of the Civil Service, or another senior independent voice to look into this, find out what's happened, clarify, so we can then move forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, the government says levelling up the country is one of its foremost priorities, but it was confirmed this week that the landmark Levelling Up white paper, promised since May, will not now appear until January. What should we read into the delay? Is it just a bit of innocuous rescheduling, or could it perhaps reflect not everyone in government is singing from the same policy hymn sheet? Here's our economics editor, Ben Chu.
A place in urgent need of some levelling up. Bolton's need is like many other localities across these islands, but it looks like they'll have to wait a little longer. In May, the government promised a landmark levelling up white paper by the end of this year. Now we're told not to expect it before January, more than 2 years after the government was elected on a manifesto pledge to reduce regional economic disparities in England. For the Mayor of Greater Manchester, speaking at a community centre in Bury this week, the delay is a frustration.
I'm hearing it might be delayed now to the new year, and that suggests the government still doesn't know what levelling up is or can't agree with each other about what it should be. I mean, this is frustrating in that we're ready to go. We have a vision for a London-style public transport system. We have a plan to be zero carbon as a city region by 2038. Back us to do it, and we're kind of waiting for Westminster to get its act together.
The government has declined to give a reason for the delay, but some have their suspicions.
Well, it doesn't seem to me as though the Treasury are as behind this as they should be, but the evidence is clear that you will build a more productive economy if you enhance regional economies. And if you invest in transport in the regions, you will lift the regional economy. George Osborne understood that as Chancellor. He came to the north and said, we are going to unlock the potential of these big cities of the north. And it feels as though the Treasury understood that and has now gone backwards.
After the recent rail investment plan, which it's safe to say undershot expectations, many here in the north of England feel that the government's levelling up agenda, if not quite dead, is looking decidedly unwell. If ministers are to convince people that it's alive and kicking, this very long-awaited white paper needs to come forth with a clear and coherent and bold plan. The expert consensus is that without devolution of power, levelling up simply won't happen. The UK is an international outlier in the amount of taxation raised centrally as opposed to locally, while in Germany around a third of tax is raised at a local or state level. In the UK, it's closer to a tenth. The amount of power local and regional authorities have over how money is spent in their areas is also abnormally low.
We are one of the most regionally unequal countries in the developed world, and over-centralization is one of the main reasons for this. Well, it is important to give away power because that means that levelling up can make a difference on the ground. The needs of a city like Greater Manchester are not the same of a town like Grimsby, for example, and so levelling up has the opportunity to make this happen, to address these inequalities.
The Tory Mayor of the West Midlands, visiting London today to press the claims of his region, very much shares the hopes the white paper will deliver a devolution revolution.
And devolution, does that mean more powers for mayors like you? Is that what you want to see in this?
It certainly does, and it also means more cash, actually. So my biggest priority would be the National Skills Fund, and then there's also the career service money. Another area would be the R&D funding. Huge amount of money spent on R&D, all controlled from London. We believe we know which are the sectors we're going to grow, so R&D there. And of course, actually money for brownfield remediation to get our housing schemes going as well. That's another big area we're negotiating with London.
But is the Treasury and the Chancellor Rishi Sunak on board with handing control of public spending to mayors and other local politicians?
I am picking up that the Treasury want to be convinced this is the right thing to do, but just look at the transport settlements we've just had, whether it be the integrated rail plan or whether it be the settlements for each regional area, big metropolitan areas. The Treasury has stood behind those, they're standing behind our housing funds, so there is clear evidence that where there is a good case, the Treasury will support it.
Not everyone in the North and Midlands would agree with that. The fate of places like Bolton may depend on next month's white paper delivering on the rhetoric of devolution and a genuine shift from the practice of Whitehall knows best.
Ben Chew there. Just before we go, we'll take a look at the front pages. They're all pretty much singing from the same hymn sheet. The Daily Mail has got Allegra Stratton on it, a sick joke. The moment PM spokeswoman laughed about illegal party held at number 10 last Christmas while the nation was in lockdown. Downing Street last night in crisis, joking about a lockdown-busting party they insist never happened. The Guardian has the PM accused of lying after number 10 team filmed joking about the party. And then the Mirror is going on the Gavin Williamson, this other breach or so-called breach. Another top story, broke COVID party rules. Education Chief Williamson hosted an Xmas bash during ban on socialising. That is all from us tonight, but we'll be back tomorrow. Hope you will be too. Bye-bye.